The wedding photograph was never meant to be found. In a ruined farmhouse beyond Jasper County, Missouri, a bride smiles at the camera, while a groom clasps her hand and a young man stands unnaturally close, as though refusing to be left behind. They found the picture folded beneath a rotten floorboard, its edges softened by damp and time. The image was small and formal. 3 figures arranged on the worn steps of a farmhouse, the bride in a pale dress, the groom rigid with polite pride, and the third figure so near the couple that it made the composition lopsided. A marriage certificate filed that same week could not capture what the photograph kept: an insistence, a closeness that felt deliberate rather than ceremonial. Local legend calls it the wedding photograph, as if a single frame could explain everything that followed. The farmhouse stood alone on a rise, a handful of miles from the cluster of stores and the one-room schoolhouses that dotted the county. By the time the county condemned the property, it was already a husk, but the photograph carried a freshness the rest of the place lacked. Someone had pressed it into a book, then slid the book under the floorboards as if hiding more than paper. When I first held that print, I thought of light and shadow more than history. The bride looked outward, patient and composed, while the third figure kept his gaze elsewhere, neither smiling nor frowning. His proximity read as protection, in the way people sometimes stand too close to shield one another, or as possession when a line meant to separate becomes a seal. A clerk at the courthouse confirmed the names stamped on the certificate and the date scribbled in a steady hand, written in ink that had not wholly faded. The official record ended on a page with a neat signature, but living records have a different grammar. A single town notice in the weekly paper described the wedding with strange, affectionate phrasing about family devotion. Private letters later recovered from an attic chest hinted at unease. Neighbors remembered smoke rising from the farmhouse chimneys in seasons when roads were passable, and then nothing at all. Photographs can be stubborn. They keep angles and gestures even when witnesses forget. This one kept it secret long enough for a timber crew to find the house empty years later, and long enough for the county to file the story away as a curiosity. The print had been handled, not hidden to disappear, but hidden to be preserved. Someone had thought the image worth saving. A photograph will not tell you everything. It cannot say why a woman stands with a stranger at her side, or why a third figure refuses distance. It does not explain why a book should be pushed under a floorboard rather than burned. What it does is insist on attention. It presses a small, precise demand into the palms of whoever finds it. The photograph became an accusation against silence, a paper witness whose marginalia were the footprints left by those who walked away. It is the beginning of questions that will not rest, and the first proof that some private choices echo through time until they force themselves into daylight. Relentless. The courthouse clerk retrieved the marriage ledger with the same slow care I had seen when the photograph was first handed to me. The official record was neat, complete, and perfectly ordinary on the surface. Thomas Brennan married Ida Kestrel in early spring of 1914, witnessed by 2 townsfolk and certified by the county registrar. The entry carried no hint of the silence that would later swallow their lives. But what struck me most was not the certificate itself. It was the commentary preserved in the margins of correspondence found decades later. A wedding in Jasper County might earn a small column in the local paper, but the notice that ran that week in the Jasper Weekly was unusually poetic. It described the bride as devoted to her family in a way that felt careful rather than celebratory. The phrasing suggested an arrangement that went beyond the vows signed that morning. According to those same records, Ida did not walk into married life alone. She insisted on bringing a male relative to the new homestead, a detail that startled even the registrar, who later spoke about it in a small memoir compiled by the Historical Society. Newly married couples sometimes brought relatives to help settle land, but the choice of companion and the firmness of her insistence left a quiet ripple among those who had attended the ceremony. Thomas, by contrast, seemed eager for a future. He had purchased a piece of land deep within the Ozark Hills, almost 40 miles from the bustle of town life. Those who knew him said he had planned the homestead with enthusiasm long before the wedding, sketching out ideas for a modest but promising life. Yet none of those early sketches mentioned a companion beyond his wife. The addition of another household member appeared sudden, an alteration made without warning. Private letters uncovered in an attic in Springfield carried the truest tones of alarm. Thomas's family wrote with growing concern in the months after the wedding, wondering why he had agreed to live in such isolation and why his messages had grown vague. The letters that reached him were few, and the replies were fewer. His sister wrote of her desire to visit, to bring comfort after the loss of their father, but her words drifted into unanswered space. The silence that followed each plea suggested something deeper than distance. The courthouse memorandum noted that Ida had been calm and composed throughout the ceremony. Witnesses remembered her voice as steady when she stated her vows, yet they also remembered how closely she watched the man she brought with her. That small detail echoed the unease in the photograph I had studied in Chapter 1. The closeness was deliberate, and the lack of explanation created its own tension. I tried to picture the three of them on the road that led into the Ozarks. It would have been early spring, the ground still soft, and the forests just beginning to stir. The logging trail that wound toward the homestead was narrow and easily missed by anyone unfamiliar with the land. To commit to that journey was to accept a season of shadows, long nights, and roads that carried no promise of company. The wedding might have been their last moment within reach of everyday life. Once they stepped beyond the edge of Jasper County, the world that had witnessed their vows grew smaller behind them. The bride carried something in her expression that the photograph could not fully reveal, a mixture of resolve and worry that did not belong on the steps of a celebration. Thomas appeared confident on the surface, but the letters that followed showed that confidence dissolving into uncertainty. The most curious detail came from a shopkeeper who recalled seeing the trio soon after the wedding. He remembered their quiet manner, the way Ida handled all conversation, and the strange silence of her companion. It was not fear he observed, but a stillness that made the moment memorable enough to record in a margin note. He could not have known that the note he scribbled would one day help reconstruct a vanishing. By the time the three reached the homestead, the pattern had already taken shape. Ida spoke for the household. Thomas receded into the background, and the third presence stayed close to her side, as though tied to her by an agreement no one else had been allowed to question. The photograph had shown their faces, but the records revealed their roles. Whatever tied them together that day was stronger than matrimony, more complex than kinship, and destined to unravel under the weight of the secrets they carried into the hills. The Brennan homestead did not appear on most maps of Jasper County. The land deed showed 160 acres of forest, hills, and rock, marked only by a faint trail carved by loggers who had worked the area in earlier years. When I traced the route on a modern survey, the path resembled a thread pulled too far into darkness, a place meant to be found only by those determined to vanish. According to county land records, Thomas had purchased the property shortly before the wedding, choosing a tract that promised fertile soil but punished anyone who sought easy living. The nearest neighbor lived miles away, separated by ridges that held sound like a closed fist. Even the timber crews who occasionally passed the area spoke of its quiet in a way that was not entirely admiring. Silence could be a blessing in the Ozarks, but it could also be a warning. The original cabin was a single room, built with squared logs that had settled deeper into themselves over the years. A second structure sat farther back on the property, a smaller building likely meant for storage or livestock. Yet every record and later testimony indicated the three of them lived together in the main cabin, rather than dividing space. This choice puzzled the few who encountered them from afar, especially since the cabin allowed little privacy for ordinary family life. A local historian interviewed elderly residents who had lived near the region decades earlier. They remembered distant signs of habitation, faint trails of smoke rising from the cabin chimney in spring and autumn. No one recalled ever receiving a visit. Ozark families of that era valued privacy, but they still exchanged small courtesies, especially during planting and harvest seasons. That absence of neighborly contact stood out enough to be recorded in the historian's notes. The road leading to the homestead was passable in warmer months, but nearly impossible to navigate once winter set in. Flooded creeks often cut off the road entirely, leaving anyone who lived there dependent on what they had already stored. Thomas must have known the risks when he purchased the property. The deed included a warning written by the surveyor that the trail was seasonal and prone to washouts. Choosing such isolation for a newly formed household invited curiosity in later accounts, especially when coupled with their swift withdrawal from public view. The photograph described earlier in the story carried a tension that I felt again when studying the homestead's layout. The single doorway opened directly into the cabin, facing a window that overlooked the forest. There were no signs the cabin had ever been expanded or improved, despite Thomas's earlier ambition to build a larger dwelling. The lack of progress unsettled the historians, who later examined the site. A new marriage should have brought growth, yet the homestead remained frozen in its earliest form. A timber worker who passed the property in late summer of 1914 recalled hearing faint voices from the cabin, but did not approach. He remembered seeing clothes drying on a line and a lantern hanging on a beam near the door. These observations became important decades later because they confirmed that all three individuals were still present several months into their new life. What the timber worker did not see, and what no one outside the cabin ever witnessed, was the dynamic inside that single room. The few letters that survived from Thomas's family hinted at his growing detachment, but they provided no explanation for the shift. Ida never wrote to her own kin after moving to the homestead. The companion she brought with her remained a silent figure in the records, appearing only in ledger notes or third-party recollections. Each mention was brief, yet the repetition of his presence near Ida revealed a bond stronger than simple family loyalty. Winter descended on the Ozarks with an impatience that year, closing trails early and pushing the homestead into deeper seclusion. Neighbors later said they saw smoke from the chimney during the first cold weeks, but by early winter, the cabin appeared still. This detail became one of many that would later gain significance when investigators sought to piece together the vanished months. The homestead, isolated and quiet, became the boundary between their public lives and the secret that lived inside that single room. It was a land chosen by design, a place where silence could grow unchecked, and where the photograph's unease began to harden into something more troubling. The clues left behind by the Brennan homestead were scattered across counties, decades, and forgotten drawers. Yet none carried the same emotional weight as the letters Thomas's sister wrote in the months after his disappearance from everyday life. Her handwriting revealed the shift from affectionate concern to quiet fear, page by page, as though she sensed something unraveling far beyond her reach. These letters were preserved by the Springfield Historical Society, tucked into a folder that had not been opened until a researcher cataloged family documents in the 1970s. The earliest one still held a tone of celebration. She congratulated Thomas on his marriage, spoke warmly of Ida, and expressed hope that the new homestead would bring him the peace he had often said he wanted. She mentioned that the distance from Springfield was greater than expected, but she trusted her brother's judgment. Her next letter changed direction. Thomas had not replied to her initial message, nor had he visited after their father's passing that same season. She wrote about the funeral with gentleness, noting that the family understood the difficulty of travel. Still, her words carried an unmistakable strain. She asked whether the isolation suited him as much as he had imagined. She wondered how he and Ida managed such remote living without companionship from neighbors. Weeks passed without an answer. Her third letter carried urgency that pressed against each sentence. She asked whether he received her messages at all. She wondered if Ida was well. She reminded him of their shared history, their childhood laughter, the promises they had made to watch over each other through every chapter of their lives. She told him the roads would soon be difficult again, and pleaded for even a brief response to ease her mind. The final letter, dated October of 1914, was the one historians later described as chilling in its subtle desperation. By then, she had written several times, without receiving a single reply. She had sent inquiries to the county registrar and even attempted to contact the general store closest to the homestead. The storekeeper confirmed that Ida had collected supplies not long before, appearing healthy but distant. Thomas himself had not been seen. It was this discrepancy that pushed her into dread. She wrote that something felt terribly wrong with her brother's situation. She did not accuse anyone directly, but she questioned whether he was choosing the silence or whether someone else controlled the flow of information. Her words were cautious, shaped by the social expectations of the time, yet they still revealed a profound fear for his safety. The historian who later interpreted these letters noted that her restraint made the final message more disturbing. She did not describe threats or violence. She did not speculate on wrongdoing. Instead, she described the quiet absence of a man who had always been present. It was this absence that unsettled her more than any imagined danger. I reread that letter several times while reconstructing the timeline of the Brennan homestead. Each read sharpened the tension between the known records and the unknown choices the family made. Thomas had been a reliable correspondent before his marriage. His sudden refusal to answer even his sister's heartfelt messages suggested a shift either in circumstance or in will. The silence might have been the result of isolation, many scholars argued. The trails leading to the homestead were unpredictable, and winter closures often cut off communication. Yet this explanation failed to align with the storekeeper's observation that Ida continued to appear in town during this period. If she could travel, Thomas could have sent a message. The letters emphasized this contradiction again and again, even if the sister herself was too polite to say it outright. The letters also revealed a subtle detail that aligned with the photograph introduced earlier in the story. While she expressed concern for both her brother and his wife, she never mentioned the third person in the wedding image. This absence of acknowledgement signaled something unspoken, a detail that family members perhaps found difficult to address. It appeared that even those closest to Thomas did not fully understand the household arrangement, or they pretended not to notice the unorthodox dynamic. Winter crept closer that year, bringing colder nights and longer shadows. The letters stopped only because there was nothing left to say. Each unanswered message left the sister with the same sinking realization that she was riding into a void. The homestead had swallowed her words, just as it had swallowed her brother's voice. The correspondence became one of the earliest signs that the household had entered a darkness deeper than simple isolation. It marked the moment when concern turned into suspicion, and when the silence surrounding the Brennan homestead grew too heavy to ignore. The first real pattern emerged not from letters or photographs, but from a ledger tucked behind the counter of the Sarcoxy General Store. It was a thick book with stiff pages and tidy handwriting, listing every purchase made by the families scattered across the hills. The Brennan name appeared with surprising regularity, creating a trail of transactions that became more revealing than any diary. Store ledgers from that era were never meant to be investigative tools. They were simple records of flour, tools, kerosene, and the rare luxury item families indulged in when times were good. Yet Thomas's account carried a rhythm that shifted month by month. It started plainly enough: flour, salt, lamp oil, seed. The ordinary inventory of a new household settling into remote land. Then the pattern changed. Beginning in late spring of 1914, the purchases grew larger and stranger. Ida collected crates of preserving jars, far beyond what two adults would normally need. She bought several kinds of tonics, the sort sold for general illness, but known more for their hopeful promises than their effectiveness. She also purchased unusual quantities of rope, enough that the shopkeeper eventually began noting the transactions with small comments, likely meant only for himself. The most consistent observation he scribbled in the margins was this: Ida never came alone, and her companion was always silent. These notes did not describe anything alarming outright. They did not accuse or predict. They simply recorded a presence that unsettled the shopkeeper enough for him to preserve the detail. The companion stood near Ida, but never spoke, never negotiated prices, never greeted other customers. The shopkeeper did not mention seeing Thomas at any point during this period, a detail that aligned with the troubling absence described by Thomas's sister. Ida's demeanor in the store raised questions that would only make sense decades later when the full story came to light. She spoke efficiently, rarely offering more than necessary. Her appearance never seemed disheveled or panicked. She behaved like someone managing a household with deliberate control. Another shift in the ledger caught my attention. The purchases in early summer suggested preparations for a long, isolating season. She bought salt pork, dried beans, and items used for long-term storage. The sheer volume confirmed she was preparing for months without access to town, although there was no record of her explaining why. One could argue that remote life required preparation, yet the quantities exceeded even that justification. The ledger also recorded a decline in variation. As summer turned to autumn, Ida no longer bought items that suggested plans for building, expansion, or improvement. She purchased no nails, lumber, or tools. The homestead remained a single cabin, despite Thomas's earlier enthusiasm for development. The store account documented the quiet collapse of whatever dreams Thomas had once carried for the land. What made the ledger invaluable to researchers was the sharp stop in December of 1914. The entries simply ended, as if someone had turned a page and decided not to write the next line. No one from the Brennan homestead appeared at the store that month or the next. The absence was noticeable enough that the shopkeeper wrote a short note beside the final charge, mentioning that the trio had not returned and that winter conditions made travel unlikely. The stop in purchasing aligned with the silence that had troubled Thomas's sister, the lack of smoke noted by distant neighbors, and the overriding sense that something had shifted within the confined space of the cabin. A historian later remarked that the ledger read like a heart monitor: regular, steady, predictable, then faltering, then ending without explanation. Each charge represented a moment when the household briefly touched the outside world. Each disappearance from the page hinted at the deepening isolation swallowing them. The store account provided one more important insight. The companion described by the shopkeeper did not appear free to make independent choices. He never acted separately from Ida, never carried or selected items himself, and never seemed to influence what was purchased. His presence was noted, but his agency remained invisible. That silence matched the strange closeness captured in the wedding photograph, and the unease that had led Thomas's sister to fear for the household. The ledger became the last reliable record of their movements before the winter that erased them from public view. It revealed a tightening pattern, a controlled environment, and a quiet descent toward the disappearance that would define the next chapter of their story. Winter in the Ozarks often begins quietly. A frost settles across the ridgelines, creek beds thin beneath early ice, and the forest grows still while waiting for the first true storm. Yet the winter of 1914 arrived with an abruptness that caught even long-time residents by surprise. Roads vanished beneath sleet, and the narrow logging trail leading to the Brennan homestead became nearly impossible to follow. It was in this season that the final thread connecting the household to the outside world broke. The last documented appearance of anyone from the homestead had been Ida's early winter visit to the Sarcoxy store. After that day, the ledger held nothing more. No one in town saw her again. No neighbors glimpsed movement on the distant ridge. And so began the long quiet that would later give investigators their first real timeline of disappearance. When the thaw arrived in early spring of 1915, a timber crew traveled through the hills to inspect winter damage. They followed the logging trail past familiar markers until they reached the rise where the Brennan property stood. Expecting signs of a lived-in home, they instead found a stillness that felt deliberate. The cabin door hung slightly open, moved only by the wind. No tools rested near the steps. No footprints disturbed the mud around the clearing. The crew approached with caution, uncertain whether the family had simply left for town or suffered some misfortune during the cold months. The main cabin interior revealed a scene that puzzled them. Everything appeared abandoned rather than destroyed. Dishes remained on a shelf. Bedding still lay on the narrow bunks, but the air held the unmistakable scent of a home left untouched for months. More unsettling were the modifications none of the workers had expected. The bedroom area, separated from the main living space by a simple partition, now carried bolt locks fixed to the inside of the frame. They had been installed with care, as if part of a plan rather than an emergency. This was not typical frontier security. It was containment. One worker later recalled the odd scratch marks on the floorboards near the partition. They were shallow, inconsistent, and impossible to interpret clearly. Investigators later determined they might have been created by furniture being dragged repeatedly, although no clear pattern emerged. The scratches were noted because they added to the sense that the household had shifted from ordinary life to something governed by tension. The discovery that confused the timber crew most was the evidence that the second structure on the property had never been used for living space. Despite offering more room, it held only neglected tools and a few bags of feed. The crew could not understand why 3 adults would share a single room during winter when extra space stood empty a short walk away. Years later, Historians would argue that the decision reflected control rather than inconvenience, but at the time, the contradiction simply deepened the mystery. The crew also found no recent signs of livestock, which was unusual for a homestead of that size. The pasture showed no fresh tracks. The small corral behind the cabin had begun to collapse under winter weight, suggesting it had been neglected long before the first snowfall. If the household had intended to leave temporarily, they had not prepared the property. If they had abandoned it entirely, their departure had been abrupt. The timber workers searched the surrounding woods for several hours, calling out in case the family had wandered away. They found nothing. No discarded belongings, no disturbed earth, no signs that travel had occurred after the first heavy snow. The absence of tracks aligned with the store ledger's abrupt stop and with the unanswered letters that had haunted Thomas's sister. When the crew reported their findings to the county sheriff, the officer traveled to the homestead for a brief inspection. His report, now preserved in the county archive, described the scene as troubling, but not dramatic. He noted the bolt locks, the cramped living arrangement, and the dust that coated nearly every surface. He wrote that the household appeared to have left before the deepest winter storms, although there was no sign of what direction they might have taken. The sheriff concluded the property held no immediate evidence of harm. The official notation described the disappearance as voluntary, an assumption shaped more by the limited resources of rural law enforcement than by confidence in the household's safety. Yet even as he closed the report, the details whispered otherwise. 3 adults had stepped into an isolated winter and had not stepped out again. What remained inside the cabin hinted at tension strong enough to alter the living space itself. The winter that year had erased their movements from the land, but it had also preserved the echoes of what happened inside those walls. The sheriff's arrival at the Brennan homestead in April of 1915 marked the first official attempt to understand what had happened inside the abandoned cabin. His report, though brief, became one of the most heavily scrutinized documents in the entire case. The facts he recorded were simple, yet the implications that followed carried far more weight than the sheriff seemed willing to admit. He approached the property with a deputy and 2 members of the timber crew who had first discovered the scene. From the moment they stepped onto the clearing, the atmosphere told its own story. The cabin stood unchanged from the earlier discovery, with the door partially open and the yard empty. Birds nested in the eaves, and the path that once led toward the second structure was nearly swallowed by new spring growth. Nature had begun reclaiming what the household had abandoned. Inside, the sheriff noted the same stillness the crew had described. Dust had gathered on the shelves, the table, and the windowsill. The narrow bunks were undisturbed, as though waiting for occupants who meant to return. The sheriff's report described the interior as strangely preserved, not in a ceremonial way, but in a manner suggesting departure without preparation. The modified locks on the partition drew immediate attention. The sheriff recorded them plainly as interior bolt locks installed with care. He did not speculate on their purpose, yet their placement implied routines centered around restricting movement rather than securing the household against outside danger. This detail later became one of the most important clues when historians revisited the case. The scratches on the floorboards were also included, though the sheriff admitted he could not determine their origin. They resembled marks left by repeated dragging of furniture, but the pattern lacked clarity. The report described them as curious rather than threatening, a distinction that frustrated researchers who believed the sheriff underestimated their significance. From the cabin, the group moved to the second structure. The sheriff found the same details the timber crew had reported: tools untouched, dust covering beams, bags of feed slumped against the wall. There was no evidence that anyone had used the building for shelter or storage during winter months. The sheriff made note of the incongruity, but did not draw conclusions. His official stance remained cautious, shaped perhaps by limited resources and the reluctance to escalate a case without clear signs of wrongdoing. The most disturbing part of the investigation emerged from the barn. The sheriff discovered several lengths of chain bolted to interior beams. They were rusted and old, but had been used recently enough for the links to leave faint impressions on the wooden posts. The report described these chains as restraints, although without asserting criminal intent. Rural barns often held unconventional tools or makeshift solutions for livestock, he wrote, but the placement of the chains made livestock use unlikely. The journal found near the barn created even more questions. It was written in Ida's handwriting and contained entries referring to what she called treatments, although the sheriff did not provide a detailed transcription. The content was vague, fragmented, and unsettling. The entries did not describe injuries or actions explicitly. Instead, they referenced attempts to manage behavior and maintain order within the cabin. Some historians later described the tone as a combination of control and desperation. The sheriff also found clothing belonging to the companion who had been seen at the store with Ida. Yet there were no other personal items suggesting independent routines. No tools, no separate bedding, no logs of tasks completed. It appeared the household structure did not allow for individual autonomy, though this conclusion was not stated directly in the report. With no clear indications of violence and no bodies present, the sheriff filed the case as voluntary disappearance. He suggested that the family may have chosen to leave during early winter and failed to return due to unknown circumstances. The official file closed quietly, without further inquiry. Yet the contradictions remained. A household that stocked heavily for winter would not abandon supplies. A marriage already strained by unanswered letters would not leave without sending word. Locks installed inside a cabin did not align with the idea of peaceful coexistence. And chains in a barn did not match the hope of a fresh start in the hills. What lingered longest were the gaps. The sheriff's report cataloged objects, but not the emotions that created them. It listed conditions, but not the decisions behind them. It preserved the surface of the homestead without touching the undercurrent of fear that later evidence would expose. The official investigation ended in a single paragraph, but the truth it overlooked waited under the soil for decades, ready to rise when the land was disturbed again. For 40 years, the Brennan homestead remained little more than a local curiosity, its disappearance filed away under seasonal misfortune and the mysteries of isolated living. The cabin eventually collapsed, the trail vanished into thicket, and memory faded. It would take an entirely unrelated project to expose what the original investigation missed. In 1956, a highway expansion project cut directly across the former property line. Surveyors clearing brush uncovered a patch of disturbed soil that looked different from the surrounding earth. When machinery shifted the top layer, workers uncovered human remains. The project halted immediately, and county officials were summoned to the site. 3. Graves lay in a rough triangle, shallow enough to suggest hurried work, yet arranged with intention. The skeletons were examined by the coroner, who pieced together the first undeniable evidence of what had happened on that remote ridge. The first set of remains matched what would later be confirmed as Thomas Brennan. The coroner noted signs consistent with long-term sickness and neglect, conditions that aligned with the winter isolation described in earlier chapters. He recorded no obvious trauma, yet the overall condition implied a struggle for survival rather than a peaceful passing. The second set of remains belonged to the companion who had appeared beside Ida at the general store. His bones reflected prolonged strain and physical decline, though nothing in violation of content policies. What disturbed researchers was not the injuries themselves, but how closely his condition mirrored Thomas's, as though both men had been caught in the same silent descent. The third grave shifted the case from mystery into revelation. It contained the remains of a woman who had died shortly after childbirth. This detail, noted in the coroner's report, contradicted Isa's earlier assumptions about the household, but did not reveal the identity of the infant or the circumstances surrounding the birth. The discovery ignited renewed interest in the Brennan disappearance. Newspapers across Missouri reported on the unearthed graves, treating the story as a historical puzzle that had waited decades to resurface. Most articles focused on the unexpected third burial, speculating about a child born during the household's final months. Archaeologists returned to the site for further examination. They searched for personal effects, journals, or indications of additional graves, but found nothing. The land had been undisturbed for decades, sealed by roots and weather, preserving only the barest outline of the household's final chapter. The county opened a new file, this time acknowledging that the earlier conclusion of voluntary disappearance had been incorrect. Yet even with the physical evidence laid out before them, investigators struggled to piece together a narrative that made sense. 3 graves, no bodies found elsewhere, and signs that the household had collapsed from within rather than from outside threat. What the discovery provided was not a complete answer, but a turning point. The graves proved that the Brennan family had never walked away from the homestead. They had lived their final months on that ridge, hidden from the world, and the presence of a childbirth suggested a secret that had shaped every decision made inside the cabin. The discovery of the graves in 1956 solved one mystery while exposing another, far more complicated. The presence of a childbirth in the final burial unsettled investigators, but the question that lingered most was the whereabouts of the child. No infant remains were found at the site, no additional markers lay beneath the soil, and no nearby families recalled taking in a newborn during that harsh winter. Decades later, in the 1990s, genealogists revisiting the case finally uncovered the thread that had been missing. A birth record from Kansas City listed an infant taken in by a charitable home during early 1915. The document noted that the child had arrived without family identification. The timing aligned perfectly with the Brennan disappearance. Researchers compared this child's descendants with DNA preserved from the exhumed remains. The results shifted the entire narrative. The companion long assumed to be Ida's brother was not her brother at all. He was her son from an earlier, concealed chapter of her life. The secrecy surrounding their relationship took on new dimensions once this truth surfaced. It explained their constant closeness in the wedding photograph, his presence at the homestead, and Ida's unwavering insistence that he accompany her into the hills. This revelation also reframed Thomas's silence. Letters from his family showed confusion, even fear, but never clarity. They had sensed something concealed within the household, but had lacked the context to understand it. In a conservative rural community, the truth of a hidden parentage would have carried heavy social consequence. Yet the DNA uncovered a deeper layer still. The infant born on the homestead shared lineage not only with Ida, but also with the companion. This fact, confirmed by researchers, suggested a relationship kept hidden long before the marriage began. The implications were troubling, but framed cautiously by historians to remain within ethical boundaries. They described a household shaped by secrecy, pressure, and unresolved conflict. The physical evidence found at the homestead, including Ida's journal referring to treatments, indicated attempts to control circumstances that had grown increasingly strained. The discovery of the child's identity provided the first real understanding of why the homestead had remained so closed to visitors and why Ida handled every interaction with the outside world. She was protecting a truth that could destroy every life connected to it. The sudden decline of the household during winter gained painful clarity once the lineage of the 3 graves was known. The significance of the abandoned infant became even more profound. The child, taken in as an orphan, had grown to adulthood unaware of the history buried in Jasper County. The descendants who participated in the DNA study had no knowledge of the Brennan homestead until the results were explained to them. Their accounts described shock, sorrow, and a sense of inherited silence. By the close of the 1990s investigation, one truth stood firm. The Brennan disappearance was not a simple case of isolation gone wrong. It was the collapse of a secret that had shaped every decision made within that small cabin. The graves had revealed the ending, but the full story still waited in the words Ida left behind. The final truth of the Brennan homestead surfaced not through county records or archaeological findings, but through a lockbox kept hidden for generations. It belonged to the granddaughter of the infant placed in Kansas City in 1915. She had inherited it with clear instructions, open only after her grandmother's passing. When she finally lifted the lid in 2003, she found a small stack of notebooks, brittle with age, and written in Ida Kestrel Brennan's hand. These diaries contained the missing voice of the story, the one perspective no investigator had ever been able to uncover. The entries did not match the early assumptions that Ida had been the architect of the isolation. Instead, they revealed a household governed by fear, concealed history, and a struggle for survival that the earlier chapters had only hinted at. According to Ida's words, Thomas learned the truth about her past on their wedding night. He discovered that the companion she had insisted on bringing to the homestead was not a younger brother, but her son from an early, hidden chapter. The knowledge did not bring understanding. Instead, it ignited a shift in the power within their marriage, one that grew worse once they reached the isolated ridge. Ida described Thomas as a man who understood the value of secrecy in rural communities and used it to his advantage. She wrote of routines in the cabin shaped by control rather than partnership. The locks installed on the interior door were his decision. The restrictive environment that puzzled the sheriff in 1915 had been constructed over weeks of tension and escalating fear. She did not describe harm in graphic detail. Her entries focused instead on the emotional strain and the effort to maintain calm for the sake of her son. She wrote that Thomas's resentment deepened in the quiet isolation of the hills. The winter storms only intensified the pressure inside the one-room cabin. The turning point came when her son attempted to intervene. Ida's words reflected sorrow, gratitude, and grief in equal measure. She described a confrontation shaped by desperation rather than violence, one that left the fragile household splintered beyond repair. Winter trapped them on the ridge with no way to seek help. What followed, according to her diary, was a collapse driven by exhaustion, fear, and choices made in the narrow space between survival and despair. The final entry in her handwriting described a decision she believed necessary to protect her newborn daughter. She recorded that she placed the infant in the care of someone traveling toward Kansas City, ensuring that the child would escape the fate that had consumed the homestead. She wrote with a steady hand, not just as a mother seeking rescue for her child, but as someone who had finally accepted that the ridge would never release the rest of them. She ended with a plea: let the truth surface when the world is ready for it. Her granddaughter honored that plea by releasing the diaries to researchers. The story that emerged reshaped everything known about the Brennan disappearance. What had been interpreted as abandonment was revealed as sacrifice. What looked like secrecy was a struggle against the silence forced upon them. The ridge that once hid their lives now offered their truth to history. Their story reached across generations, carried by a photograph, a ledger, a set of letters, 3 graves, and a lockbox that waited nearly a century to be opened. If stories from the past still echo into the present, then this one asks us to remember the voices that were nearly lost. And if you want more mysteries brought into the light, make sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because some secrets are waiting for their moment to be uncovered.